that approach, that status signaling approach, can also explain why political correctness is firstly getting more extreme, and why, even though social justice warriors generally get their way, they're never happy. They always have the impression that everything works against them. So normally when they say we want to no platform the speaker, normally they get their way. They can no platform people who they don't want speaking, and they can exercise political particular words, particular expressions. They usually get their way, and politically correct witch hunts almost always end with the person who is the subject of that witch hunt apologizing afterwards. It almost never happens that somebody sticks to their guns and says, no, I did nothing wrong. If my words have been misinterpreted, I stick to what I've said. That never happens. It almost always happens with that person saying, I am so sorry for the offense that I caused, and so forth. So you always get the result, like at a Stalinist show trial, where the victim has to then accuse themselves and self-recriminate, and in that sense, social justice warriors clearly do get their way, but nonetheless, they never seem happy. And the status signaling approach can explain that fact as well, because if politically correct opinions are like a Rolex watch, a status symbol, then that has a number of implications, because status symbols are, in economic terms, a very peculiar kind of good, in the sense that they are markers of distinction, and they lose their value when other people acquire them too. So if I came in here with a Rolex watch in order to show off, to impress you how much money I have, and then I discover that you all have Rolex watches, well, that would be sort of self-defeating. Because then if everybody has a Rolex watch, it is no longer a marker of distinction. So the marker of distinction, the status good, is in that sense like a deserted beach. It is inherently scarce. We cannot all go to the deserted beach, because if we all go there, it is no longer deserted. So it is a good which is by definition scarce. It's not scarce in the sense that this bar here, they can run out of beer, in this sense, so then beer would be scarce, and that could cause conflicts if we all want more beer, and there's not enough for all of us. But that's a technical problem. That could be solved by just brewing more, delivering more. Whereas a marker of distinction is inherently scarce. It doesn't actually, you can of course create more Rolex watches, you can create more of the good itself, but you would thereby destroy its value. The value that people derive from it, the distinction, is by definition scarce. Its utility comes from the fact that other people don't have it. If I had the Rolex watch in order to impress you, then my utility that I derive from it would come from the fact that you don't have them. And that's something which an economist in the 19th century explored. Thorstein Veblen, he came up with what we now call a status symbol, something that seems obvious in hindsight but wasn't obvious then. And he described how different people hunting for status symbols, how that is actually a zero-sum game, because the gains they derive cancel each other out. They may acquire their status good, but if other people get it too, then it cancels out the advantages to the first owner. And that is something that you can actually apply to a lot of things. So what was incomplete in this Veblen theory was that he thought of status signaling as meaning you signal that you have money. Status in Veblen's world meant money. But that's actually, at least for a more modern economy, no longer true. People can use all kinds of goods as status goods. A status good doesn't have to show that you have money. You can also use status goods in order to show that you are more sophisticated than other people or more educated. It can be a lot of things. Can be almost anything. People can compete in a lot of different respects. So a lot of goods that you may just consume because you enjoy them might be status goods for other people. You could consume a particular beer from a microbrewery because it has a certain hipster status. But then again, that is something which is inherently scarce. If everybody then buys that beer, it is no longer a niche product. It no longer serves to signal a special form of sophistication. And then there's a great book about that, which is called The Rebel Cell, How Counterculture Became Consumer Culture. That's a book which helped me to understand political correctness, even though it is not at all about political correctness, but it is about this mechanism of conspicuous consumption. That book describes a number of movements that defined themselves, or waves of movements that defined themselves as countercultural. So it starts with the beatniks and then goes on with the hippies in the 60s and 70s, and then punks in the 80s, and then grunge people in the 90s, and the early Nirvana fans, and goths and what have you, all kinds of alternative subcultures. And the authors point out that those movements, those sort of self-perceived countercultural movements, often started from the premise that the preceding movement had sold out. So punks in the 80s would say that the hippies had become part of the consumer culture, part of the problem, that they had sold out at some point. And therefore something new was needed. And the authors of this book, The Rebel Cell, explain why that is a misconception. It's not that any of these movements ever sold out. What happened was simply that you get a movement that starts as a countercultural movement, that starts as an alternative lifestyle movement, and the people who form this movement in the early stages then derive a certain social status from that, because that requires the reputation of being edgy, cool, something that you want to be. And then other people see that, and they also want a slice of this coolness cake. They want to be part of that movement. And then, but in this way, more and more people join the alleged counterculture, the alleged alternative subculture. But if lots of people join, it is no longer alternative. But if you define yourself as countercultural, then you also need a mainstream culture against which you can define yourself. So being alternative, being countercultural is, again, like the deserted beach. We cannot all be alternative. If a particular style is seen as provocative, edgy, alternative, and people derive a certain social status from that, and if that then becomes cool, others imitate it, then it ceases to be cool. Because coolness is also a positional good. It's like a Veblen good. It's something that only works if not everybody has it. And perhaps another incarnation of that, before I get, you can see the parallels here to political correctness, but another application of this, which is quite relevant at the moment, would be gentrification, because that's the same phenomenon. You get a group of early movers, a group of social innovators who move to an area, a borough, that then acquires a reputation for being edgy and cool because a certain type of person is attracted to it. Artists, and especially in the beginning, alternative musicians and whatever, they move there. They give that borough a certain fame and glory, and then you get other people who also want to be part of that. But if everybody does that, then it ceases to be cool. It is no longer a distinction. It's no longer very special. So places like Brixton or Shoreditch would be very good examples of that. If you had said 20 years ago, I live in Brixton, people would have said, oh, wow. But nowadays, everybody moves to Shoreditch. Everybody moves to Brixton. It's no longer... well, it is the deserted beach all over again. It's no longer cool because everybody does it. And that, in that sense, coolness is also a positional good, and coolness is also inherently scarce. But it's quite different from the earlier form of positional goods, from the Veblen goods, which are about showing that you have money, because these kind of goods, these coolness goods, are a lot easier to acquire and to imitate. So suppose you wanted to pretend that you're rich, even though you're not. Well, that's very difficult, because status symbols like, say, a house in Mayfair, you could not just buy a house in Mayfair just to pretend that you're rich, because unless you actually really are rich, you couldn't afford it. So therefore, this is a status symbol which will probably remain a status symbol over a long period of time. This is a stable solution. But with coolness goods, it's not quite like that, because it's a lot easier to buy a CD from a band that is perceived alternative and edgy. It's a lot easier to move to a place like Shoreditch or Brixton than it would be to move to Mayfair, because here in Mayfair they can effectively make sure that not all and sundry can move there by the prices, but you cannot keep people out of Shoreditch in that way. You cannot force them to take a coolness test before they get permission to move to Shoreditch. So if you have all the uncool people moving in, then you get a problem, because the early movers, well, how can they show that they are early movers? You don't see. If somebody says, I live in Brixton, I live in Shoreditch, there's no way that they can signal that they already lived there before it was cool. And that's why you get these conflicts. People who protest against gentrification are never people who grew up in that borough. They're never people who have deep roots. They're almost always the first wave of gentrifiers. They're people who moved there while it still had that social status. And the reason why they are now so heavily opposed to other people moving there is that it undermines their social status. Right, because of this intrinsic scarcity. And that explains why anti-gentrification people, protesters, are normally also opposed to building new houses in a gentrifying area. Which, if you take them at face value, if you take this argument, oh, we're just against hipsters moving in because they're driving up the prices. If you take that at face value, then opposition to new development would be illogical. If you don't allow new development, that's when you get price competition. If you have the same number of houses but more and more people coming, that's when prices escalate. If you allow development, then you can actually keep prices more or less stable, even in a gentrifying area. But the reason why they're opposed to that is, well, you can keep the prices stable, but you can't keep the coolness signal intact if everybody moves there. So that is why it makes perfect sense for anti-gentrification protesters, like these, you've all read the story, but these serial killer cafe people who threw color bombs against the window of that cafe in order to drive out the hipsters. That's really about status competition, because these serial killer cafe people, well, they're undermining the status of the early movers. Now you can see where I'm trying to go with this. That's what happens with political correctness as well. If politically correct people use certain words, certain expressions as status symbols, then they have a problem if other people do that too, if other people copy that behavior, if it becomes mainstream. So, for example, this idea that you're now no longer supposed to say he when you're referring to somebody of an unspecified gender. If you say the average voter, you're not supposed to say he, you have to say they, because you don't know whether it's a he, could be a she, or the economics textbook therefore always says the representative consumer, will then sometimes say they or she, avoiding the word he. But that's become mainstream. A lot of people do that now. And if you want to show your feminist credentials, and if everybody talks the way you talk, well, how do you differentiate yourself? And that's the reason why political correctness becomes more extreme. That's why you have to see instances of sexism in events that would otherwise seem quite harmless and mundane to other people, such as somebody commenting on a profile picture and saying this is objectifying, and that is because what used to be the markers of feminist credentials 10 years ago are now mainstream, and that in that way you can explain why politically correct people have to become more extreme over time, because that's how you defend your edge, your social status. So it would be the same as people who support, who are fans of some style of music that is considered alternative, and when that style becomes mainstream, they move to more extreme groups. And there's a parallel here. I mean, I remember this was the first time that I saw this sort of status seeking in action, even though I didn't understand it at the time. When I was a teenager, mid-90s, the band Nirvana was getting very popular. And a lot of kids at my school, boys in particular, tried to look like Kurt Cobain with varying degrees of success. Now, who was most opposed to that? Not the teachers and not the parents, but the early Nirvana fans. Because if you had come to my school at any random day in 1994, 1995, you wouldn't have been able to tell who were the early movers, the early Nirvana fans, and who were the imitators. And it's the same with politically correct speech. You can't tell if somebody uses the correct expression, if somebody says they rather than he. You can't tell whether I just started with that yesterday or whether I was one of the early movers who always used that expression. And that's why you get these tendencies of finding microaggressions where almost everything becomes somehow dodgy, and where you get accusations of dog whistling, saying, yeah, well, this looks harmless, but there is something underneath here. And that is how people who see...
wolf whistling?
What did I say?
Dog whistling? No, wolf whistling is certainly improper, I think. Sorry.
No, I meant the accusation. When somebody says something that seems quite harmless, but somebody says, a politically correct person says, oh, no, there's a hidden message in there. Is that a dog whistle then?
Yeah. Oh, silent. Yes, I see. Yes,
you can only hear at a certain frequency if you're especially fine-tuned, if you have very politically correct fine-tuned antennas. And
like dogs now.
Like dogs. And the metaphorical, politically correct dogs would then communicate that ability, that they can hear those sounds that ordinary people are unable to hear, and therefore it doesn't actually work against them if it seems ridiculous to an outsider. That's actually the point. It has to be ridiculous because it's meant to be a signaling opinion. If it were something that anyone could support, then it wouldn't be much of a signaling opinion anymore. And that is, but there we have a fundamental conflict at the heart of political correctness, because all these other groups that I mentioned, the early Nirvana fans, punks, whatever it is, the gentrifiers, the last thing on earth that they want is that other people imitate their style, right? They want to freeze things at a certain point when the band that they're fans of, or the borough that they live, has just the right level of coolness perception, so that people know about it, but not yet mainstream enough so that they actually want to move there. And they try to freeze it at that point. With political correctness, it's very different. They want to keep that edge, that moral superiority, but they're also trying to force their norms on everybody. And because they succeed, they then undermine their own objective of standing out. And that is the fundamental conflict, and that's the explanation, I would say, the economic explanation why political correctness is so unhinged. And that's the reason why it will probably become more unhinged in the foreseeable future. Thank you.